The fluorescent lights of the audition room buzzed overhead as I flipped through the stack of headshots on the table in front of me, and my hand froze when I got to the 7th photo in the pile. I was staring at a face I had not seen in 10 years, a face that had been surgically rebuilt so many times that the woman in the picture only resembled my sister if you knew exactly where to look, in the shape of her eyes, in the small mole near her left ear that no surgeon had ever touched. Her name was printed at the top of the application in bold black letters, Presley Calloway, and underneath it, in the section marked, "Why do you want to be the face of Vale Atelier?" She had written 3 sentences about needing a fresh start and believing she still had what it took to make it in this industry at 36 years old. I set the photo down very slowly and looked up at my 2 co-judges, a sharp-eyed casting director named Odessa Vale and my creative director, a soft-spoken man named Theo Brannigan who had been with me since the earliest, hungriest days of my company. Neither of them knew who Presley Calloway was to me, because for 10 years, almost nobody in this industry knew my real last name. Because for 10 years I had built my entire career, my entire identity, under the name Odessa Vale instead of Odessa Calloway. I had built a wall between the girl I used to be and the woman I had become, brick by brick, campaign by campaign, and now that wall was about to be tested in a room with bright lights and a folding table and a stack of 8 by 10 photographs. "Bring in the next group," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt, because that is the thing nobody tells you about becoming a strong woman, that most of the time you are performing strength for exactly as long as it takes for the real strength to catch up with you. I set Presley's photo on top of the pile, face down, and I waited. If you want to understand how I ended up sitting behind that table, holding my sister's future in my hands without her even knowing it, you have to go back to a kitchen in Millbrook, Ohio, 25 years ago, to a woman named Marlene Calloway standing over a stove with her back to her 2 daughters, saying words that would shape the next 2.5 decades of my life. I was 9 years old the first time my mother called me the ugly daughter, and she did not say it to hurt me, at least that is what she told herself. She said it the way you might comment on the weather, flat and factual, as if my face and my sister Presley's face were simply 2 different products on a shelf, and she was only being honest about which one people would buy. Presley was 7 then, 2 years younger than me, with a heart-shaped face and enormous blue eyes that people stopped to compliment in grocery store checkout lines. And I had my father's face, square-jawed, wide-nosed, with a gap between my front teeth that my mother refused to pay to fix even though she found the money, year after year, for things Presley needed. My father, Gordon Calloway, worked long shifts at a manufacturing plant an hour outside of town, and he was a quiet man who loved us both in a distracted, exhausted sort of way. But he never once contradicted my mother in front of us, not when she signed Presley up for her first pageant at age 5, not when she spent grocery money on professional headshots for a 7-year-old, and not on the day I am about to tell you about, the day that I think, looking back, was the real beginning of everything that happened later. I was 14 years old, and I had come home from school with a permission slip for a school trip to Washington, D.C., $180 due by Friday. And I remember standing in the kitchen doorway holding that piece of paper while my mother sat at the table with Presley, poring over a glossy brochure from a cosmetic surgery clinic 2 hours away in Columbus. Presley was 12, and she had started crying about her nose a few months earlier after a boy in her class made a comment, and my mother had decided, right then and there, that the solution was not comfort or perspective, but a consultation with a plastic surgeon. "Mom, I need this signed," I said, holding out the permission slip, and she did not even look up from the brochure. "We do not have money for field trips right now, Odessa," she said, and then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Besides, it is not like you need to be seen in the Capitol making friends with boys. You have never had that kind of trouble to worry about." I did not understand the full cruelty of that sentence until years later, when I sat with a very patient therapist in Milan and finally said it out loud in a language that was not my own, because somehow it hurt less in Italian. What my mother meant What she always meant with comments like that was that I did not have to worry about being pretty because I simply was not, so why bother spending moan? I on experiences meant for girls who had something to lose. That same year, my mother found $600 for Presley's first rhinoplasty consultation deposit. Money that came, I later learned, from a small inheritance my grandmother had left specifically for both of our college funds. I did not find that out until I was 22 years old and filling out financial aid paperwork for graduate school, staring at a bank statement that showed my portion of that inheritance had been $0, while Presley's face, over the years, had been reshaped 4 separate times. There was a particular Sunday dinner, when I was 16, that I still think about more than almost any other memory from my childhood. My Aunt Dolores was visiting, and she made an offhand comment about how striking I was becoming, how I had my father's strong bone structure, and my mother laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Odessa is the practical one, thank goodness, because we could never have afforded 2 beautiful daughters in this family." And everyone at the table chuckled along with her except my father, who stared very hard at his plate, and Presley, who looked at me with something that I did not understand at the time, but that I now recognize as a strange, guilty pity, because even at 14 years old, my sister knew that what our mother said was not right, even if she never once told her to stop. I want to be honest with you about something, because this is not a simple story where one sister is a villain and the other is a saint. Presley did not ask to be the favorite. She did not ask for the surgeries or the pageant coaching or the modeling classes that ate up our family's money for over a decade. But she also did not refuse them. Not when she was 12, not when she was 16, not when she was 20 and still living at home, while my mother took out a second loan against the house to pay for a breast augmentation that Presley wanted before she attempted, unsuccessfully, to break into the Cleveland modeling scene. My sister benefited from a system that was actively starving me. And even if she did not build that system, she never once tried to dismantle it either. And there is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from watching someone who is supposed to love you simply let it happen over and over, for years. I found my own way out through books and spreadsheets, which is a strange combination, I know, but it is the truth. I was good at math in a way that nobody in my family valued, and I found a kind of safety in numbers that I could not find in mirrors. I worked at a diner starting at 15, saving nearly every dollar in a coffee can hidden in the back of my closet, and I applied for every scholarship I could find. And when I got a partial scholarship to Ohio State for business, my mother's reaction was to ask, in front of Presley, whether I was sure I would not be more comfortable at a smaller school, since Ohio State was, in her words, a lot of pretty people to be around. I left for college with 2 suitcases and $1,100 from that coffee can, and I remember my father hugging me in the driveway, holding on a little too long, and whispering that he was proud of me, the only time he ever said those exact words out loud in my entire childhood. My mother stood on the porch and waved, and Presley, 17 at the time, ran down the driveway at the last second and hugged me hard and said, "You are going to do something amazing, Des, I know it." And I remember feeling so many conflicting things at once, love for my sister and resentment toward her, hope for my own future and grief for the childhood I was leaving behind unfinished. College was where I discovered the fashion industry, not the glamorous side that Presley had been chasing since she was 5 years old, but the business side, the supply chains and the brand strategy and the merchandising math that most people never think about when they see a beautiful dress on a runway. I took an internship at a small textile importer during my junior year, and I fell in love with the mechanics of it, the way a piece of fabric could travel through a dozen hands and a dozen countries before it became something a woman felt beautiful in. I worked nights at a call center to cover my expenses, and I studied every spare hour. And by the time I graduated, I had a business degree, almost no debt because of the scholarships and the relentless saving, and a plane ticket to Milan that I had bought with money from a summer internship at a fashion trade company that offered to sponsor my visa. I want to pause here and tell you something important, because it matters for what comes later in this story. I did not leave Ohio because I hated my family. I left because I needed distance to figure out who I was when nobody was calling me the practical one, the smart one, the ugly one, the consolation prize. I needed an ocean between myself and a kitchen table, where my worth had been decided for me before I was old enough to object. Milan nearly broke me in the first 2 years. I lived in a shared apartment with 4 other women. I ate pasta with butter more nights than I care to admit, and I worked an unpaid internship at a small fashion house during the day and translated documents for extra cash at night. I remember calling home exactly twice in my first year abroad, and both times my mother spent most of the call updating me on Presley's modeling auditions in Cleveland. How close she was to getting signed, how a scout had told her she had real potential, and I remember hanging up the phone both times feeling like I had called the wrong number, like I had reached a house where I no longer had a room. But something happened in Milan that never had a chance to happen in Millbrook, Ohio. People started to respect me for things that had nothing to do with my face. My eye for pattern and proportion, my ability to read a spreadsheet and see the story hidden inside it, my willingness to work 18-hour days without complaint because I had spent my whole life being told I had nothing else to offer. So I offered everything I had. I got promoted twice in 3 years at that fashion house, and by the time I was 26, I was managing production for an entire seasonal line. I started my own small line at 28, working out of a rented studio space with 2 seamstresses and a business partner named Farah Akhafer, a brilliant Nigerian-British designer I had met at a trade show in Paris. We called the brand Vale Atelier, and I chose the name Vale for 2 reasons, because it sounded clean and European and forgettable in the best way, and because it was close enough to my mother's maiden name, Valentine, that some quiet, complicated part of me still wanted a thread connecting me back to a family I had not entirely given up on, even after everything. I changed my professional name to Odessa Vale not out of shame, but out of a hard, practical decision. I had learned, through painful experience, that people in the industry who found out about my family background, the pageant mom, the sister with the modeling dreams, tended to see me differently, tended to ask if I was really cut out for the beauty and fashion world or if I was just trying to prove something. I got tired of explaining myself, so I stopped. Odessa Vale was a woman with no complicated backstory, just a sharp eye and a work ethic, and for 10 years, that was exactly the woman I needed to be to survive. Vale Atelier grew slowly, and then, in the way these things sometimes happen, very quickly. We built a reputation for tailoring that respected real women's bodies, for campaigns that used models of every size and age and skin tone, because I had spent my entire childhood being told that only one narrow kind of beauty mattered, and I built my company as a quiet, sustained rebellion against that lesson. By the time I was 35, Vale Atelier had boutiques in 6 countries and a global campaign budget that made industry magazines write profile pieces asking who this mysterious, media-shy founder Odessa Vale really was. I sent money home during all those years, not to my mother, but to my father quietly, so he could retire early from the plant before his back gave out completely. I called Presley on her birthday every year, brief, polite calls that never went below the surface. I did not call my mother at all, not for almost 8 years, and if you had asked me during that time whether I had forgiven her, I would have told you I had moved past needing to forgive her, which is a lie people tell themselves when the wound is still too raw to look at directly. That brings us back to the audition room, to the folding table and the fluorescent lights and my sisters face down on top of a stack of photographs. We were casting for what would become the largest campaign in Vale Atelier's history, a global initiative called Real Vale, built entirely around women over 35. Because I wanted, more than almost anything else I had ever wanted professionally, to build something that told women my mother's age and my own age that their worth did not expire the moment a wrinkle appeared or a surgeon's work started to show its seams. Casting calls had gone out through agencies across the country, open to any woman who wanted to submit, no professional experience required, because I wanted real stories, not just polished portfolios. I had not personally reviewed the applications before that day. That was normally Odessa's job. And I remember the specific, sick lurch in my stomach when the assistant called the next group into the room and Presley Calloway walked in, 36 years old, her face pulled tight in places that faces are not naturally tight. Her lips fuller than any lips in our family had ever been, wearing a blazer that looked like it had been bought for an audition she had researched careful. Why, trying so hard to look like a woman who had it all together? She did not recognize me at first. I understood why. I had changed my hair. I wore glasses now that I did not need for anything except changing the shape of my face in photographs. And the last time she had seen me, I was 22 years old and 80 pounds heavier than I am now. Not because I dieted myself down, but because 10 years of walking every cobblestone street in Milan and eating real food instead of stress food had simply changed my body along the way bodies change when a person is no longer marinating in constant shame. "Hi, thank you so much for having me," Presley said, addressing all three of us at the table, her voice bright and practiced. And Odessa asked her the standard opening questions, her name, her age, why she wanted to be part of this particular campaign, and Presley answered every question smoothly until Odessa asked, "And what does real beauty mean to you at this stage of your life?" I watched my sister's composure crack for just a second, watched something genuine slip through the practiced brightness. "Honestly," she said, "I spent most of my life thinking beauty meant looking a certain way, being fixed, being perfected, because that is what I was taught. My mother believed that, and she taught it to me before I even understood what I was agreeing to. I have spent a lot of money and a lot of years chasing something that was never actually going to make me feel whole. And I am 36 years old, and I do not know how to explain this without sounding like I am trying to say the right thing for the judges. But I think I finally want to be part of something that tells the truth instead of selling a lie." The room was quiet for a moment. Theo, beside me, nodded slowly, genuinely moved, and Odessa made a note on her clipboard. And then Presley's eyes moved to me, really looked at me, the head judge who had not said a single word yet, and I watched the recognition arrive in her face the way a wave arrives on a shore, slow and then sudden and then complete. "Des," she said, and her voice cracked on the single syllable of my old nickname. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. I had a choice in that moment, the kind of choice that shapes not just a single afternoon, but an entire chapter of a life. I could have denied it, redirected the audition, protected the wall I had spent 10 years building. Instead, I set down my pen and I said, "Hello, Presley." We did not finish the audition that day. I asked Odessa and Theo to give us the room, and they did, professional enough not to ask questions yet, though I knew the questions were coming. My sister sat across from me at that folding table, and for a long time neither of us said anything at all, and then she started to cry, not the composed, camera-ready crying she must have practiced for auditions, but the ugly, gasping crying of a person whose careful mask has been ripped away without warning. "You built all this," she said, gesturing vaguely at the room, at the branding on the wall, at the entire enormous fact of Vale Atelier. "This is yours. Odessa Vale is you." "It is," I said. "Mom is going to lose her mind," Presley said, and then she laughed, a wet, startled laugh, and added, "She has literally sat in her living room and told her friends for years that she does not understand why some designer named Odessa Vale has never done an interview, because it drives her crazy not knowing anything about her. And it was you the whole time." I did not laugh with her, not yet. Instead, I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest for 10 years. "Why did you apply here, Presley? Out of every modeling opportunity in this entire country, why this one?" She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing a little of her carefully applied makeup, and she told me the truth, or at least the truth as she understood it in that moment. Her modeling career had never taken off the way our mother promised her it would. She had worked steadily, but modestly for over a decade, regional catalog work, small local campaigns, nothing that ever matched the scale of the dream she had been raised inside of since she was 5 years old. She had spent, by her own estimate, over $60,000 on surgeries and procedures over the years, some of it our mother's money, much of it her own credit card debt once she was old enough to fund the habit herself. And she said the word habit like she already knew, somewhere underneath the makeup, exactly what it had become. "I saw the casting call because it went viral online," she said. "Real women, real stories, no age limit. And I thought, for the first time in 10 years, maybe I do not have to be perfect to be chosen. Maybe I could just be honest instead. I did not know it was your brand, Des. I swear to you, I did not know." I believed her. I want to be clear about that because this is not a story about catching my sister in some elaborate scheme. She had walked into that room carrying her own decade of quiet unraveling, just like I had walked in carrying mine, and neither of us had known the other one would be on the other side of that folding table. Here is the twist that changed everything I thought I understood about my own childhood, the wrong assumption that had shaped an entire family for over 2 decades. I had always believed, in the deepest part of myself, that my mother chose Presley over me because Presley was simply prettier, because beauty was a fixed, unfair lottery, and I had lost it before I was even born. But sitting there with my sister, hearing pieces of the last 10 years I had missed, I started to understand something much sadder and much more complicated. My mother had grown up the plain daughter herself, in a house 1 town over from Millbrook, raised by a mother, my grandmother, who had entered her into a beauty pageant at age 6, and then spent the next decade telling her she had failed to live up to it. My mother had internalized a belief, deep and unquestioned, that a woman's worth in this world was measured almost entirely by how closely she matched a narrow, cruel standard of beauty. And when she had 2 daughters of her own, she was not choosing a favorite out of malice. She was frantically trying to protect the daughter she believed was vulnerable to the same pain she had lived through, while writing off the other daughter as already safe, already spared, simply because I did not match that same narrow standard. It did not make what she did right. It did not undo 1 single year of the damage. But it explained something that had never made sense to me before, why my mother had spent money my family did not have chasing a version of safety for Presley that she herself had never been given, while starving me of resources because she genuinely, wrongly, believed I did not need them, that my ordinary face was somehow a form of protection rather than a wound in its own right. I decided, sitting in that room with my sister, that I was not going to build the next chapter of this story on cold revenge. I want to explain why, because I know some of you watching this might feel like my mother deserved to be publicly humiliated, cut off, made to watch from a distance as I built an empire she had told me I was too ugly to build. I understood that impulse. I had felt it myself, alone in my Milan apartment at 23 years old, imagining the day I would walk back into that Ohio kitchen and show my mother exactly how wrong she had been. But revenge, cold and clean, would have kept me exactly where my mother had left me, still defining my worth by her reaction to it. I did not want a moment of triumph over my mother. I wanted an actual family, healed and honest, even if that meant doing the harder, slower work of accountability instead of the easier, sharper satisfaction of punishment. I flew Presley and my mother out to New York together 3 weeks later, not for an audition, but for a conversation, and I want to walk you through exactly how that conversation went, because I think the honesty of it matters more than any dramatic confrontation scene could. My mother walked into the conference room at Vale Atelier's headquarters looking smaller than I remembered her, 61 years old now, her hair more gray than I expected. And when she saw me standing there, when she understood that her daughter Odessa, the practical one, the ugly one, was the founder and CEO of a company with her name on the door in 6 countries, she did not gloat or celebrate or immediately apologize. She stood very still for a long moment, and then she said quietly, "I do not understand how this is possible." "Sit down, Mom," I said, and she did. I did not open with anger. I had spent enough years and enough money on my own therapy to know that leading with anger in that room would have given her an easy target to defend against, would have let her retreat into the version of the story where I was the overly sensitive daughter who had never appreciated how hard she worked to give Presley opportunities. Instead, I opened with facts. I laid out, calmly, the inheritance money that had gone to Presley's first surgery instead of being split evenly between us. I laid out the exact dollar amount of the second mortgage taken against the house when I was 19. I laid out 10 specific comments, word for word, that I had carried with me for over 2 decades. Comments she likely did not even remember saying, because for her they had been small, forgettable moments. And for me, they had been load-bearing walls in the architecture of how I saw myself. My mother cried, and I want to be honest, my instinct in that moment was to comfort her, because I had spent my whole childhood managing other people's feelings before my own, and it took real effort to sit with her tears without rushing to fix them for H. Presley reached over and took our mother's hand, and I let the silence sit there for a long moment before I spoke again. I am not telling you this to punish you, I said. I am telling you this because I need you to actually see it, not apologize in the abstract, not tell me you are sorry I feel hurt, but understand specifically what happened and why it was wrong. My mother looked up at me, and something in her face shifted, the defensive tightness easing into something rawer and more honest. Your grandmother did the same thing to me, she said. I told myself I was protecting you by not putting you through what she put me through. I told myself Presley needed help and you were strong enough to be fine without it. I was wrong, Odessa. I was so wrong. I took the very thing that hurt me my whole life, and I just handed it to a different daughter instead of putting it down. It was not a perfect apology. It still carried a shadow of explanation, of context offered almost like a shield. But it was honest, and it was the first time in my entire life that my mother had said the words "I was wrong" to me without a single qualifier attached. I told her clearly what I needed going forward, not as an ultimatum designed to punish her, but as an honest description of the only path I could see toward an actual relationship. I told her I needed her to attend therapy, real ongoing therapy, not a single session to appease me, but sustained work with a counselor who specialized in family patterns and body image. Because I did not believe surface-level apologies could undo a belief system that had been passed down for at least 2 generations. I told her I needed transparency about the family finances, an honest accounting, not because I wanted the money back, but because I needed to know she was capable of looking at the truth without flinching away from it. And I told her that any relationship between us going forward would be built slowly, with real boundaries, and that I would not tolerate a single comment, ever again, comparing my worth to Presley's appearance, not as a joke, not as an offhand remark, nothing. My mother agreed to all of it, and I want to tell you that I did not fully believe her in that room, not because I thought she was lying, but because I had learned, the hard way, that promises made in an emotional moment are cheap, and that the only currency that actually matters is sustained action over time. Presley's part of this story unfolded differently, and in some ways it was harder for her, because she had to reckon not just with what our mother did to her, funneling her entire sense of worth into a body that would never be perfect enough to satisfy the fear underneath our mother's obsession, but also with her own complicity in staying silent while I was pushed to the margins of our family for over a decade. She told me, during a long walk we took through Central Park a few days after that meeting, that she had known, even as a teenager, that what was happening to me was wrong, and that she had said nothing because speaking up felt like it might cost her the only version of love she had ever been offered. I am not asking you to forgive me right now, she said. I just need you to know that I have known for a long time, I was a coward and you paid for it. I did not offer her instant forgiveness either, and I think that surprised her, because I think some part of her, and some part of my mother too, had quietly hoped that the reveal of my success would function like a magic wand, that the shock and awe of Vale Atelier would simply erase 2 decades of damage the moment everyone understood how impressive I had become. But healing does not work on a business timeline, and I told both of them, separately and together, that trust would be rebuilt through consistent, ordinary actions over months, not through one dramatic afternoon in a New York conference room. Here is what that rebuilding actually looked like, in real, unglamorous detail, because I think that is the part most family drama stories skip over in favor of a quick, satisfying ending. My mother started seeing a therapist named Dr. Inez Whitfield twice a month, and after about 4 months, with my mother's explicit permission, Dr. Whitfield invited me to join 2 sessions specifically focused on family communication, and I watched my mother, in that small, quiet office, describe her own mother's cruelty in detail for what she told me was the very first time in her entire life. I watched her connect, slowly and sometimes painfully, the dots between her own childhood wound and the wound she had passed on to me, and I want to tell you, it did not erase what she did, but it made the apology real in a way it had not been in that first conference room conversation, because now it was built on understanding instead of just guilt. Presley withdrew from the audition process entirely, not because I asked her to, but because she told about 6 weeks after our first conversation, that she needed to figure out who she was without chasing a modeling career that had always really been about proving something to our mother, rather than about anything she actually wanted for herself. She started working instead with a nonprofit organization focused on body image education for teenage girls, using her own story, surgeries, and all as a cautionary example rather than an aspirational one. And I have to tell you, watching my sister stand in front of a room of 14-year-old girls and say, out loud, "I spent $60,000 trying to fix a face that was never broken, and I am still learning how to live in it," was one of the proudest moments I have had in this entire decade-long journey. My father, who had remained quiet through most of this, finally spoke up during a family dinner about 5 months into this process, the first time all 4 of us had been in the same room since I was 18 years old. He told my mother, gently but firmly, that he had known for years something was wrong in how she treated her daughters differently, and that his silence had been its own kind of failure. And he apologized to me directly, tears in his eyes, for never once standing between his wife and the comments that had shaped so much of my childhood. I forgave him faster than I forgave my mother, not because his failure was smaller, but because his apology asked for nothing in return, offered no defense, just plain accountability. Around the 8-month mark, my mother asked if she could see the studio where Vale Atelier's designs were made, and I brought her to our production floor in Queens, and I watched her walk slowly along the tables where seamstresses were working on the real Vale campaign pieces, watched her stop in front of a large printed image of one of our featured models, a 71-year-old woman named Constance Ojusanya with silver locks and laugh lines she had refused to have smoothed away for the campaign. My mother stood in front of that photograph for a long time, and then she said, quietly, almost to herself, "I wish I had known this kind of beauty was allowed." I did not fully understand, until that exact moment, how much of my mother's cruelty toward me had actually been grief for a version of beauty and worth she had never been permitted to believe in for herself. By the 1-year mark, I had built what I would call a real, if imperfect, relationship with both my mother and my sister, one with clear boundaries and clear history, and none of the false, glossy reconciliation you sometimes see in stories like this. My mother still occasionally slipped into old patterns of comparison, but she caught herself now, out loud, correcting course in real time in a way she never once did during my entire childhood. Presley and I talked at least once a week, and she had started, slowly, to reduce her dependence on cosmetic procedures, not because I demanded it, but because the therapy work she had started alongside my mother had begun to loosen the grip that fear had held on her for over 2 decades. The Real Veil campaign launched 14 months after that first audition day, and Presley was not in it, not as a model. But I asked her, with her full consent and enthusiasm, to be interviewed for a short documentary piece that accompanied the campaign's launch, speaking honestly about growing up inside a family that had taught both of us the wrong lessons about beauty and about the long, unglamorous work of unlearning them. My mother sat in the front row at the launch event in New York, and when the documentary clip played, when Presley's voice filled the room describing our childhood with an honesty that would have been impossible 18 months earlier, I watched my mother reach for my father's hand and hold it through the entire thing, tears running freely down her face, not performing emotion for an audience, just feeling it, finally, fully. In front of her family, instead of hidden away where it could never do the work of actually changing anything. I gave a short speech that night, the first public remarks I had ever given as Odessa Vale, and I told the room, without giving away every private detail, that this campaign existed because I had spent a childhood being told my face did not count as beautiful, and that I had spent my 20s believing the only way to prove that wrong was to build something enormous and undeniable, and that I had spent my 30s learning, slowly and with real difficulty, that the actual healing did not come from the size of the company or the number of countries it operated in, but from a folding table in an audition room where I chose honesty over distance, and a family that chose accountability over easy comfort. After the event, my mother found me near the entrance, away from the crowd, and she held both of my hands in hers, something she had not done since I was a very small child, low. NG before Presley was even born. "You did not need me to see you as beautiful for you to become this," she said. "I understand that now, but I am so grateful you let me see it anyway." I hugged her, and I want to tell you, it was not a magical, wound-closing hug that erased 25 years of pain in a single instant, because that is not how real families heal. It was a hug between two women who had done a year of hard, deliberate work to rebuild something that had been broken for a long time, and it held all of that work inside it. The therapy sessions, and the honest conversations, and the slow, patient rebuilding of trust, one ordinary Tuesday phone call at a time. Presley moved to New York about 6 months after the launch, close enough that we see each other regularly now, and she recently told me she is considering going back to school, not for modeling, but for counseling, specifically to work with young women navigating body image and family pressure. And every time she tells me about a class she is taking or a workshop she has attended, I feel something in my chest ease a little further. The last remnants of a wall I built brick by brick over 10 years finally coming down, not because it was torn down by force, but because it was no longer needed. My mother still calls me every Sunday, and sometimes we talk about nothing important at all, about the weather in Ohio, about a recipe she is trying, about my father's garden. And I used to think that kind of ordinary, uneventful conversation was something other families got to have and mine never would. And now I understand that ordinary conversation is not the absence of a story. It is the reward at the end of one, the quiet, hard-won proof that the healing actually took. I think about that folding table often, the moment my sister's face turned up recognition in a room full of fluorescent light, and I think about how easy it would have been to let that moment become a weapon instead of a doorway. I am glad every single day that I chose the doorway instead, because the woman on the other side of it is not just a successful founder with boutiques in 6 countries. She is a daughter who finally has a mother who sees her, and a sister who finally has a sister who trusts her. And that, more than any campaign or any headline or any number on a balance sheet, is the thing I spent my entire life quietly, desperately hoping to build.